Well, now I'm moving into my second, and I'll just warn you right from the beginning, almost certainly longest lecture on Greek sculpture, which is going to cover the early, middle, and late classical periods, the height of Greek art. We will have a more complete sense of this period, and especially what's known as early classical severe style, when we look at architectural sculpture in the next lecture. I had a hard time deciding whether to put those friezes and pediment sculptures into the sculpture or into the architecture section, and decided in the end that it made sense to look at them in their architectural and functional context, but just be warned, there's more sculpture to come. So what we're looking at now is the art of a culture that is supremely confident in itself in the face of a huge victory against a numerically superior adversary, and the victory of a kind of democracy against an empire. However, the Greeks will lose some of this confidence before long. We're also going to see a trend toward art serving first a civic and then a more individual function. It's not that the Greek work is not at all religious, but Greek religion does not tend to be personal. The gods are given offerings, they're appeased, they're placated. They're not really appealed to as much on a personal level, although we'll see that change somewhat as we move into the Hellenistic period. Instead, we're really looking at art that celebrates, on the one hand, civic virtue, the contribution to the community as rewarded by the gods, and also individual perfection. This is the art of confidence. Maybe, as we'll see, it turns out to be the art of overconfidence. Okay, this is one of the most famous works, one you absolutely have to know, because this statue represents a technical breakthrough and actually captures, more than probably any other work, the transition from archaic to classical sculpture. I almost often cut some of the images out of these textbook slides, which I find a little busy, but I appreciate in this case the way the slide captures the pose from many different angles. So what's the name for the innovation that we witness in Critias Boy? How is it different from the archaic sculptures that precede? By the way, one obvious thing that won't really be mentioned in the next slide, so I might as well say it now, is what's different about the head. The hair is no longer long and stylized. We're looking at a different kind of hairstyle. This may be change in fashion, but I think it's also a move to a more naturalistic and realistic as opposed to stylized and symbolic way of portraying the head. Any rate, again, the most important element of the Critias Boy is contrapposto, or a change in the way weight is borne and the stance is portrayed. Contrapposto is an Italian word that we would translate literally as counterpoise. In this, one leg bears the weight while the other is relaxed. When the pose is captured realistically in art, it shows up as a tilt or asymmetry in an axis or imaginary line that we could draw across the hips and the shoulders, and you're going to see that in the slides coming up. Here is an example of a statue that does not have contrapposto. You may recognize Menkaure and his bride, or we think his bride, from Old Egypt. You do see a foot going forward, but there's no evidence that the weight is being shifted. And in fact, what this really is one leg that turns out to be significantly longer than the other. In other words, conceptual, not optical art. The figures are very stiff. Even though the foot seems to be moving, the sculpture itself does not really convey movement. And here again, you see an archaic Kouros, more realistic, nude, of course, somewhat more facial expression, but still highly stylized and unnaturally stiff. Notice that the shoulders are level. They're more rounded than in the earlier Orientalizing period, but still they're rigid and they're completely frontal. The hips are level. Both fists are level. Even the knees are level, even though the left leg is thrust forward. So if this pose were recreated in nature, the left leg would have to be 6 inches longer. Again, this is not optically accurate art. And here we see the axis lines drawn in. So you have all of these straight lines, and then suddenly, unrealistically, this slanted line at the bottom. In nature, this couldn't be done. Okay, now we see contrapposto showing up in early classical art. So contrapposto first appeared in classical Greek sculpture. These axis lines help illustrate the many ways in which the artist captures a more realistic pose. By the way, oops, I didn't mean to get rid of that yet, excuse me. A term I didn't include in this, but probably should have, is symmetria, which is different from symmetry. It's the same word with an R-I-A instead of a Y, but it actually means a balance created by imbalance. Counterpoise means it's a contrast. Instead of a symmetry, one half looking like the other half, you create a sense of balance by actually tilting and shifting. So in this case, notice that the left leg, and actually we're looking at the right leg, the whole facing things is always difficult. The right leg and the bent arm, in other words, those that are opposite ends from each other, are both tensed, whereas the other arm and the bent leg are relaxed. Again, symmetria or counterpoise, contrasting it with each other. You also see a left shoulder that's higher than the right shoulder, an acute angle formed between the left shoulder and the right hip, which in turn is higher than the left hip. And again, this is that counterpoise or balance or symmetria, which is formed by not making the shoulder and hip axis straight or horizontal. The shoulders, in other words, counterbalance the hips. Also notice that the knees are not level, but instead are angled. And the turned and tilted head finally breaks out of the rigidly frontal pose of previous statues. And that, too, adds to the naturalness of the pose. Okay, now I think we get to move on. Okay, the classical Greeks progressed to where they were able to model the human in a non-symmetrical, relaxed stance that appears much more realistic. That's really a repeat of what I just said. But I would note that this skill was actually lost during the Middle Ages and was really only rediscovered by artists like Donatello during the Renaissance. So here, just by means of comparison, on the left you see the archaic kouros, a very good archaic kouros, but still stiff, symmetrical, not counterpoised, without contrapposto. You see our contrapposto figure, and then you see Donatello's famous David, to which we will return, I promise or threaten, later in the course. And in this statue, which was a bronze that was recovered from the sea, it had been lost in a shipwreck off Riace. Here we see the whole contrapposto technique taken another step, basically. In this work, the weight shift is even more obvious and it's even more extreme. The sculpture expands even more out of its initial envelope into space. I've used these terms before, but it uses negative space. It has open space around it that becomes part of the work. The arms are essentially freed from the body to occupy a much larger spatial sphere. And this is one of the ways in which Greek art is very innovative and will very much influence Renaissance art. Actually, this spatial expansion is another thing that largely disappears, as we'll see in the Middle Ages. Here again, we see the Riace bronze warrior next to the Critias boy. Notice more sense of movement in space, larger envelope, less calmness. I would say also a somewhat more expressive face, but the classical style is not as emotional as we will see actually in the late classical and even more in the Hellenistic. This is still the ideal of the Greek athlete, scholar, the person of sound mind and sound body, driven by reason, but also consumed with physical excellence. This is a particular kind of Greek vision, which is going to come under challenge, as we'll see. This bronze figure of a charioteer used to be part of a larger group. It's actually a votive statue at the Oracle of Delphi. So this is specifically a religious statue given to honor a victory in a chariot race. On the right, you'll see a couple of efforts to reconstruct what the full statue might have looked like based on descriptions by classical authors. You know, at first glance, it seems almost archaic. So how does it differ from works of the earlier period? Well, the head is turned. It's not fully frontal. It's interesting that although this is a male figure, a kouros, it is clothed. And in fact, the clothing kind of echoes fluted columns in Greek sculpture. It's very geometric in that sense. And yet notice how these long, smooth, very elegant lines and then the curvilinear lines on top contrast with essentially the chaos of the reins. Again, this deliberate juxtaposition, this balance through imbalance, that is an aspect of Greek arts, and they call symmetria. You see a very thoughtful, profound expression. This isn't really the archaic smile, more of that severe leader of the people look that we associate with classical Greece, Greece at its apogee. And again, the arms reach out into space, or at least they did before one was lopped off. The feet move in an opposite direction from the head. The cloth, the beautifully rendered folds, emphasizes the upright stance, and it does this instead of having to rely on a rigid posture. So it accomplishes, in a sense, the same functional goal of showing serenity and control without having to create an unnatural body to go with it. I especially like the delicate and complex way the back view captures how the fabric is caught and held in the back. This is really the work of a superb artist. Well, we don't know if it's Zeus or Poseidon, because we don't know whether what he was holding in his hand and has now disappeared is a trident, which would make it Poseidon, or a thunderbolt, which would make it Zeus. But again, and this is a development in Greek art, to really comprehend this statue and particularly to see the movement that it conveys, you have to walk around it. This is art meant to be viewed in the round. And again, this is a development in Greek art that's very important. Without the telltale symbol, as I said, we can't tell which god is being portrayed here, but certainly it's a god of great power. You notice the physicality, you notice the sense of movement, but again, the fairly severe, austere face, demonstrating control, ethos, if you will, as opposed to pathos. I'll talk about that more when I get to Greek architecture, but those of you taking AP language and composition have probably already encountered those terms, ethos referring to sort of moral rightness, and pathos to feeling or emotion. There's not a lot of pathos in this sculpture. Another very famous work, another one you should probably know the author, the artist, Myron, Discobolus, or Discus Thrower. We only have it as a marble copy of a bronze original, and we know that the Roman copies were cruder, so it's just amazing to think of what the original would have been like. It's also a little weird to think of marble as being a cheap copy, but if you study the description of hollow casting, you know that making a bronze statue was very complicated and time-consuming. There was a lot of marble hanging around. Greece is basically one big rock. Anyway, the original bronze would not have needed the tree trunk to stand up, and the lines would therefore have been smoother, and the action would have been depicted more realistically. I mean, how often would an athlete lean against a tree to throw a discus? Again, let me ask you this. Does the face seem as realistic as the body? Well, the guy seems awfully calm for someone whose muscles are coiled like a spring to release a discus. And again, the facial expression on the one hand harks back to archaic statues, but it's not really smiling. Again, instead you see that sort of severe, serious expression that we associate with classical Greece and its sense of serious purpose of Greeks' leadership in the world, of the burden of that leadership. Notice, too, that this sculpture includes even more negative or empty space, but it's used in a very interesting fashion. So the arms, on the one hand, the arm touching the knee creates a closed space. There's negative space and kind of a triangle between the arm and the leg. Nevertheless, it closes off, whereas the arm holding the discus extends out into space and really opens up the universe. Again, very interesting use of surrounding space. This is something I hadn't thought of a lot before I took my art history course this summer. But the teacher in that course emphasized how important it is to look at open space, at negative space, as well as the space that's filled by a sculpture. And here again, this is a good example of a sculpture that you really have to walk around to understand the entire movement, to understand what's happening. And finally, this is another very good example of symmetria, the balance created imbalance between open and closed, between tensed and relaxed, although I would say there's not that much that's relaxed, perhaps the arm not holding the discus. Also an example of what the Greeks call rhythmos, which is just rhythm with an OS, catching that moment between action and interaction. Again, a way of depicting movement in a statue. Now this statue, the one in the middle, actually they're all the same one, Polycleitus, the Spearbearer. You need to know Polycleitus, absolutely. The statue is famous not only because, let's face it, this is a seriously beautiful guy, but also because it represents Polycleitus's famous cannon, especially before the copyist had to work in another tree trunk. And in fact, canon was what Polycleitus named the original, because he created it specifically to illustrate what he considered the mathematically ideal proportions of the human body. And these proportions, in turn, he adopted from the mathematician Pythagoras, who, to make it even more complicated, found these proportions initially in the harmonic structure of music. So this is Polycleitus's canon, not precisely in the flesh, but at least in the marble. And it is an example of what is called chiasm, chiastic cross balance. And I've really already talked about this a little bit. The arm and the leg being relaxed, the tense arm and the leg contrasting with the relaxed arm and the leg. It's deliberately asymmetric, as chiastic designs are cross-balanced, yet it still shows a kind of symmetria, against balance as opposed to pure mirror-like symmetry. The head turns right, for example, while the hips turn left. The back foot turns outward. Overall, the whole thing creates a twist, a sense of movement in the body, a movement, if you will, through geometry. And here you get a chance to see the different lines, the contrast with straight and curvilinear, the twist and the straight, again, a chiastic or cross-balanced work. Now we move into the late classical period, where life frankly gets a lot less happy for the Greeks. If 480 to 450 BCE was the heyday of Athens, the 3rd century BCE, remember that, the 4th century, I made a terrible mistake. The 4th century, the 300s. I must fix that slide. I will do that. In fact, I'm hoping it's already fixed on what you have. My apologies. The 4th century was the period when 3rd century 400s was the period when, in terms of Greek religion, the gods visited wrath on the Athenians for their overarching pride or hubris. I should probably redo that after all those errors, but I hope you followed that, and I will correct that in class. Their imperial ambitions through the Delian League stirred up protest, as I mentioned in my introductory lecture, and the Spartans were frankly all too happy to take up the anti-Athenian standard. And the fact that Athens suffered a terrible plague didn't help. The Greeks did manage to reunite somewhat in the middle of the 4th century in the face of a growing threat from the north in Macedonia. But even then, there were important divisions in Athens about whether or not this was a real threat and whether Greece, frankly, Athens in particular, anymore had the resources to muster against an enemy. By the time they decided, they probably should, it was too late, too little. King Philip II of Macedonia, that's north of Athens, really an entirely different province, wasn't really considered Greek, but barbarian, although the Macedonians, I would note, spoke Greek and considered themselves Greek. But King Philip conquered Greek and transformed a collection of city-states into a centrally ruled empire. His amazing son, Alexander the Great, would take the next Persian war to Persia itself. He would capture Persepolis, remember that from our earlier unit, and he would march his troops all the way into India, where they finally protested and refused to move forward. He died as he was turning back, basically. So in the wake of their first triumph against the Persians, the Greeks had basked in confidence. Reason would triumph. Shared values would ensure unity and victory. And so early and high classical art was the art of the rational and the victorious. And with defeat came disillusionment, a questioning of ideals, a turn inward to focus on individuals, not just ideal individuals either, but real people, people who experience setbacks as well as triumphs. Perhaps ironically, or maybe because we're not superhuman either, I think we, or at least I find it easier to appreciate the art of this and the succeeding, even more emotionally expressive Hellenistic period. Now, the great victories of Philip II and Alexander would actually bring renewed power and wealth to Greece, but it would be a different Greece. It would no longer be democratic. It would have many more people from other cultures, much more cosmopolitan. And it would be a power and a wealth that the Athenians and other city-state citizens couldn't exactly take credit for. And as I said, we will see more outside, more cosmopolitan influences enter Greek art in this period and even more in the Hellenistic period, which I will cover in my final sculpture lecture. Not to be crass, but what's the most obvious new development here? And by the way, note this sculptor, Praxiteles, another one you really need to know. Well, we have a nude woman. Sure, she's a goddess, but she is not portrayed smiting Persians or leading Athenians to victory. Stay tuned for your coming lecture on the architecture and architectural sculpture of the Athenian Acropolis. Instead, this is a domesticated goddess. And by the way, it's a characteristic of this late classical and Hellenistic period. The Greek gods of the earlier age were manlike, but superman-like. They were heroic figures. These are more approachable, more individual, if you will, more fallible gods. Getting back to this sculpture, what's this Aphrodite, that's Venus, the Greek Venus, what's she up to? She's getting into her bath. She's sticking her robe on her water urn. By the way, this was a very famous statue at the time. The people of Greece were shocked, and they traveled in droves to the town where this was exhibited so they could look at it from all sides, just to appreciate great art, right, of course. This is much more erotic art than we've seen before in Greece, at least in Greek sculpture. Somewhat different in Greek painting, we'll get to that. Greek painting, we'll get to that in my very last Greek lecture. Here is another statue by the very famous Praxiteles. Now, it's one thing for goddesses to be sensuous and preoccupied with simple domestic life. But gods? So here again, we see another sculpture by the famous Praxiteles, or again, another but somewhat better copy of a sculpture by the famous Praxiteles. So here's a story that is showing. When Zeus, the king of the gods, revealed himself to his mortal lover, Semele, she was incinerated. Basically, his divine radiance was too much for her to take, a little bit like some of the Old Testament accounts of encountering God's radiance. Zeus, however, remember how Moses had to cover his face. Zeus, however, was able to rescue their unborn child, sewed him into his own thigh, a little gross, and following the birth of the child, that was Dionysus, Zeus ordered Hermes, who was his winged rapid messenger, to hide the newborn from his jealous wife Hera. Again, remember, these are gods that behave like men. Hera wanted to destroy any remnants of this affair, including the newborn. Hermes could move fast, so he rushed the baby to a remote mountain for hiding, and nymphs raised the child. Under their care, he grew to maturity and became, frankly, the Greeks' favorite god. He was the god of wine, revelry, and theater. There are a huge number of monuments to Dionysus if you visit the Greek world. I'm reminded a little of the relief sculpture of Akhenaten and his family. I'd say this is an intimate scene. Though the props are gone, we know from ancient inscriptions that Hermes is teasing the baby with a bunch of grapes. Hermes is beautiful, but he's approachable, and the infant Dionysus looks like a real baby. In the face of disaster, again, the Greeks wanted more approachable gods. And what else might they have wanted? Greek culture was notoriously bisexual, but this didn't, until now, usually show up in the art. This Hermes, like the Aphrodite, I would say, is somewhat blatantly erotic. And what about the fellow on the left? This is another sculpture by Praxiteles, the resting satyr. So how does he represent a departure from high classical sculpture, such as Polycleitus' spear carrier, which is the guy on the right? And in the middle, I have Hermes, which is the other Praxiteles sculpture we just looked at, just, by means of comparison. Well, again, I hate to just talk about sex in art history, but I'd say that this satyr had a bit of a come-hither look. Now, satyrs were notorious sexual predators. Still, look at the hands. One seems to be reaching out an invitation, and one is resting, I would say, a little suggestively on the hip. This image isn't in your book, by the way, but I wanted you to give another example of Praxiteles' style. The textbook uses the phrase sensuous languor to describe his work. That sounds about right to me. Praxiteles' figures are also less muscular. Even the buff Hermes is not as muscle-bound as the spear carrier. And while they employ Contrapposto, the lines are more curved and sinuous. The book describes it as an S-curve. This is not the same worship of the rational, the ideal, the muscular, the energetic. Again, it's more sensual, more human, and again, I would say more approachable. Okay, this is the work of another great classical sculptor whose name you need to know. Sorry about that, but this is Lysippos. By the way, as I said, I've gone through the AP test. There are names on the test that you're going to need to know. I'll review them again in my AP review, but I won't necessarily signal exactly which names you have to know. What evolution in Greek sculpture do you witness here? Well, I think you're seeing the move toward a new canon, and Lysippos, in fact, did develop a new canon. The young man is beautiful, he's a little more slender, and the subject matter, an athlete scraping dirt and oil from his body, is more blatantly natural and physical. This is an athlete after the competition, doing something kind of ordinary, cleaning up, not winning a great victory. By the way, these are different Roman copies of the same bronze original, which is why some have fig leaves and some don't. Why would you guess that is? We don't know for certain, but it probably reflected the taste of the patron. Some of them like to have male nudity, some preferred to cover it up. This sculpture, like some of the others we've just seen, really invites us to walk around. I especially like the way the heavily muscled back is portrayed. You see that on the left. And again, we see more movement outside the narrow envelope of space. Both arms are now reaching out into that space. And in many ways, we can really only perceive the movement by seeing the statue from all directions. This is statue in the round. This is statue that occupies a large air envelope. Another feature of the classical period that I've really been hinting at, but need to mention specifically, is there's a more identifiable personal style on the part of the artist. Notice we're getting a lot of names all of a sudden. Polycleitus, again, that's his canon on the right, was attempting to establish rules that all artists would follow. His canon represented an ideal, and basically he thought all artists should sculpt like that. This was what was the point of sculpting other than the ideal? The ideal in the philosophy of Plato was really more real than the inadequate earthly copies of the idea that was being represented. Late classical sculptors, and by the way, also the philosopher Aristotle, who followed Plato, cared more about earthly variations on the idea. They were, to use a scientific term, more empirical, less idealistic. So Lysippos, again, we're seeing his work here on the left, actually proposed reforms to Polycleitus' canon. I think I've answered some of this earlier, but what differences, again, do you see? Well, Lysippos' bodies are slenderer. He prefers a less muscle-bound ideal, if you will. And the heads are roughly 1/8 the height of the body rather than 1/7 in the 5th century. Again, perhaps not as much a glorification of the brain and not as much a glorification of a hyper-muscled up, bulked up body. This is Greek statuary after they banned steroids, if you will. Here we see Lysippos again, back to the steroids in a big way. But here again, you have a statue you really need to walk around to appreciate it. So what's going on with that hidden hand? Anybody guess what the story is? Well, it's actually holding the golden apple of Hesperides, which was retrieving those apples was one of the 12 labors of Hercules. And by the way, 12 labors show up all the time in Greek statuary, and then later in European work that returns to Greek themes, particularly in the Renaissance. Again, it's another marble copy. This one was placed in the Roman baths at Caracalla in Rome, which were athletic as well as bathing facilities. Maybe it was there to egg the athletes on to lift heavier and heavier weights. But what else sets this statue apart from high Greek sculpture, from the high classical age? Well, I thought it was interesting that the textbook describes the muscles as being ironic. What does that mean? And by the way, I assume a lot of you are taking AP or will be taking AP Language and Composition next year. Oops, I think earlier I referred to you as if you were juniors, and you're not. But what does irony mean in this context? Irony is an unexpected contrast, something that jars us and captures our focus. And in this case, the irony is this unexpected contrast between the absolute incredible strength of this muscle-bound god and his obvious weariness and maybe even discouragement. This is not triumphant Hercules who's just going to get all those labors done quick and get on with being a god. Strong as he is, this Heracles is tired out, discouraged, a much more human god. And to repeat a point I've already made, this was an era when the Greeks were looking for more human gods. And the prop here, by the way, was not just added by a copyist. It is part of the original. In other words, this is a statue that tolerates and really actually embraces instability. This isn't just symmetria or chiastic counterbalance or contrapposto. This is deliberate asymmetry that isn't particularly balanced. We're going to see a lot more of this in the Hellenistic age, and this is actually really a transitional figure into the Hellenistic age. Maybe this instability reflects the uncertainty of unstable times. Speaking of which, here is a bust of Alexander the Great. It may or may not have been based on an original by Lysippus. Remember, he's the guy with the new canon. We know that he was Alexander's favorite sculptor, and he made at least one full-length bronze nude statue of Alexander holding a lance and turning his head toward the sky. Unfortunately, this has been lost, and this bust may not be a copy of Lysippus's work. I think I pronounced that about 3 different ways. I'm sorry. Though the signature turn of the head and the cap of curls lead many art historians to think that this is, in fact, a copy of the sculpture by Lysippus. It's certainly a very human portrait of an almost superhuman figure, but it does capture his youth and vitality. Again, it's an individualized portrait and not just an ideal. And if there was anyone who you would have thought might have been the subject for an ideal, it would be Alexander the Great. This isn't sculpture, it's a pebble mosaic, but since we're moving on to Alexander the Great, and this isn't really sculpture, architecture, or painting, I thought I might as well include it here because it's a work you should know. This particular stag hunting scene is an emblema, which is the central panel of a mosaic. It would be surrounded by floral patterns or geometric patterns. We will talk more about mosaic art when we get to the Byzantine period. And pebble mosaics were just that. They were done from river pebbles set in cement. I mean, this is an extraordinary work using entirely natural colors. There's no paint involved. Notice how the artist manages to show shading and musculature and volume, even with pebbles. So remember this, we talked about this back in our very first unit, how one of the challenges of a flat piece of work is to capture 3-dimensional space. Obviously, that's not a problem in sculpture, but we're back to a flat work here. That shading is called skiagraphia, which literally means shadow painting. And again, this is pebble mosaic, so I'm throwing some terms at you that you need to know. This, believe it or not, is also a pebble mosaic. Absolutely spectacular use of volume and shading. But this is probably even more famous because it depicts the victory of Alexander over Darius III. You know, again, notice the extraordinary detail and sense of volume that the artist achieved simply with river pebbles. The rearing horses in particular pose an especially tough artistic challenge, and we're going to see other artists attempting that. This is very early, and they do incredibly well. It's also worth noting how Alexander is depicted. He's the young man on the left, on the horse holding his spear. Notice he's not wearing a helmet. He's charging recklessly into the middle of the battle, and even though he's sparing some poor guy, he's focusing on Darius, who's the face turning back on horseback. Basically, Darius is already running away. And by the way, historical accounts confirm that this was Alexander's style, and one of the reasons his men would follow him all the way to India, if no further, because he himself was so extraordinarily personally brave. So in my final sculpture lecture, we'll move on to art after the death of Alexander and the Hellenistic age.